And I'm going to hit record now. So today's webinar is being recorded. With us today to talk through the CARES Act is Kris Denzel. Kris is the Director for International Policy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and is responsible for promoting the Chamber's international trade and investment agenda, including bilateral and multilateral trade agreements and negotiations. He works very closely in his role with the administration and Congress. Previously, Kris was Director of Government Affairs for the Organization for International Investment, a group representing U.S. operations of leading global companies. At the Organization for International Investment, he advocated on behalf of its members on international trade and investment issues. Prior to joining them, Kris spent more than 7 years working on Capitol Hill for Reps Robert Dole and George Holding. Kris holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from right here in Illinois at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and a Master of Arts from the U.S. Naval War College. I'll also point out that Kris is sharing with me, he is from right here in the region. So we're happy to have you kind of virtually visiting today, Kris. And just a note before I pass over the mic for all of our attendees. So Kris today is going to be talking to us for the first half of the webinar, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. So feel free throughout the webinar to be dropping your questions in that chat box. You can send them directly to me or to all attendees, totally up to you. I'll keep an eye on those questions as they come through and combine similar ones as we needed. So with that, Kris, I'll go ahead and hand you the reins. Thanks for being with us.
Jessica, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen here. So hopefully folks can see the slides once we get them up here. Can you all see the slides?
We got them.
Awesome, Jessica. Thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time today. Like Jessica mentioned, I work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Typically do investment and trade policy, but in these interesting novel times we find ourselves in, it's an all hands on deck effort. And we're all looking to get as much information as we can out there, try to answer as many questions as we can, and happy to take some of those at the end. We'll talk about those if they are very specific. I'll probably direct you to your local lenders or to your CPAs to have individualized conversations about that, because I know circumstances are unique for everyone. But once again, really appreciate the time today. Today, what I want to do is walk through the Federal CARES Act. This was the Phase 3 bill that Congress passed in relation to COVID-19 coronavirus. There was 2 previous bills. We'll touch on the second one. I won't touch on the first one. And then I'm happy to talk about what the future looks like insofar as additional legislation, additional assistance that Congress and the administration are looking to provide. So here on this first slide, just an overview of the package. So this is a $2.2 trillion package. So this is the largest economic stimulus bill our nation has ever passed, we've ever seen. Referred to Phase 3. So if you hear me say Phase 3 or CARES Act, I use those interchangeably. We're talking about this bill right in front of us today. And really what this bill is meant to be a bridge. It's meant to be a bridge between the interesting, unique circumstances we find ourselves in to when we resume normal commerce, really whatever that looks like in the future. So let me begin by talking about some of the individual provisions really quickly, and then we'll move on to the provisions for business. So as you can see on the next 2 bullets there, for individuals, the direct payments. So these have been obviously widely touted, widely talked about. You're looking at $1,200 per individual, $2,400 for a joint return, folks that file jointly, and $500 for children. And this is phased out based upon circumstances. For individuals, this will be phased out after $75,000 on the income, and then for joint, $150,000. I don't have precise guidance as to when these payments are going out the door. Last I read, I think it was possibly sometime next week or later, but just know that they're coming. The next provision at the bottom there is some expanded unemployment insurance that was provided as part of the CARES Act. And this is related to COVID-19. And what it provides is an additional $600 per week on top of a regular state benefit. And that runs through July 31st. Eligibility ends once folks can return to work. So I know that there have been some questions, some thought pieces out there about, folks, receiving this enhanced benefit and then staying off work. But, if a business were to reopen, folks were to be called back to work, they're able to work, and they choose not to, then this obviously would end. And the benefit is provided through the state UI offices. And all the folks have to be all that's needed for this eligibility is for states to opt into the program. All right, so on the employer part, so we'll talk about 2 provisions that are available to all size employers. We'll talk about very briefly some provisions that are available to your large and mid-size employers, and then at the bottom you'll see, well, that's where we'll spend the bulk of our time today, talking about provisions for small businesses, the self-employed, independent contractors, and nonprofits. And we'll talk about two key programs, the Paycheck Protection Act, which I think has received the most notoriety. We'll also talk about some changes that were made to the SBA economic injury disaster loans, these EIDL loans they may be familiar with. And then we'll talk about some provisions, as I mentioned, from that phase 2 coronavirus bill, dealing with paid sick leave and also FMLA. So for all employers. So this first one on payroll taxes. So, just before I begin here, talking through this and then talking through the provisions for small business, there's going to be interplay between these programs. There are going to be some either or scenarios. So that's why I really stress, folks to talk with your CPAs, talk with your lenders about what program, what option might be best for you given your circumstances. So as part of the CARES Act, it allows folks, employers, to delay payment of their part of the payroll tax, right? That's 6.2% Social Security. And that can be delayed between now and then the end of the year. And what happens is that 50% would be due at the end of next year, so 12/31/21. And then that other 50% would be due 12/31/22, so 2 years. And importantly, you see that third bullet there. So this is generally available to all employers except those that had a loan forgiven under the Paycheck Protection Program that we'll talk about later. Some other tax changes that are also included in the bill. There was a provision on net operating losses. So if you have a business who has a net operating loss and you want to be able to use it against prior taxes paid, now those NOLs can be expanded from 2018, 2019, 2020, generally carried back 5 years. This applies to pass-throughs and sole proprietors. So you also see that second bullet point there talking about AMT credits. I don't have much to say on that, but I'm happy to talk with folks offline about that if they are interested in that. Another provision deals with the interest deductibility, right? So this is really targeted at folks that have made investments over the last couple of years, and that's where you get into this qualified improvement property fix as well. So a lot of retail, a lot of restaurants made improvements over the years, so they can accelerate that. So these tax provisions are not so much about reducing the overall tax burden, right? This is about improving liquidity, right? And this was the overarching goal of the CARES Act, right? It was, how do we improve liquidity? How do we provide people with that bridge that I talked about until we get back to regular commerce? So you'll see varying time frames in these provisions, right? The paid sick leave has a different than what the Paycheck Protection Program, right? The programs operate on different timelines. So this is really, this is a down payment. There's already been talk about, a CARES Act 2.0, if you will. Not only, putting more money into some of these programs, but also expanding out some of the benefits. Another program that was included in the CARES Act that's available to all employers that, hasn't really received a whole lot of attention because it was a late addition. It wasn't included in the original draft, is this employee retention credit. And what this, generally applies to, all employers, and we're talking about businesses, nonprofits, for example, who are fully or partially shut down as a result of the coronavirus, or they've seen a drop in their gross receipts, a 50% drop in their gross receipts, and they're eligible until those gross receipts get back up to about 80%. So this comes in the form of a refundable tax credit. 50% of wages paid by the employer, up to $10,000 per employee. Now, there are some varying rules based upon the size of business, right? So as you'll see, if you have more than 100 employees, the benefit only applies to employees that you're paying but are not providing services. So I think a way you can think about this is that your business shut down, you've had a drop in revenue, your employee isn't working, they're not teleworking, but you continue to pay them, you can access this as a credit. If you have less than 100 employees, the requirement that they be providing services doesn't apply. It's available to all employees during the eligible pay period. The eligible pay period being when you shut down or you had a quarter with that drop in revenue that you can see up there in bullet point number 1. As you'll see, that second to last bullet point, much like the payroll provisions that we just discussed, they're not eligible if employees are not eligible for this retention credit if they receive a paycheck program loan. And this, like some of the other tax options that we talked about, comes in the form of advanced payment with refundable tax credit. So let me move here now to mid and large size employers. I won't spend too much time here. This part of the bill certainly received a lot of attention in the press, talking about, what was the government going to do for airlines, for example. So there's a variety of programs, excuse me, run through the Treasury Department and also the Fed that look at loan guarantees and other credit reserve facilities that were used after the financial crisis in 2008. So there are special programs for the airline industry and other critical national security businesses. There are restrictions contained in these programs about what companies can do after they receive assistance. That relates to stock buybacks and also to executive compensation. And I'm going to move through this, and then if people do have questions about this on the large side or mid-size, I'm happy to take those offline. Okay, so here's where we'll spend the most of our day here. Is on these provisions for small businesses, the self-employed, independent contractors, and nonprofits. So the Hallmark program, right? The program that the government is really trying to incentivize folks, the one that's most favorable, is this Paycheck Protection Program. And this is $349 billion in loans for small businesses, generally less than 500 employees, 501c3s, self-employed, sole proprietors, and independent contractors. So this is a program that went online last Friday for small businesses, goes online Friday for other folks like independent contractors and the self-employed, for example. And this is the one I think most people have probably been hearing about most in the news. So while it is $349 billion, that's expected, I think a lot of people are anticipating that given the demand, this program is probably going to run out of money because it is first come, first serve. Just this morning, in fact, the Senate tried to, approve a bill, two different bills to provide additional funds for this to the tune of $250 billion. There was a little bit of a disagreement there, so no agreement was reached at the moment, but Congress and the administration both continue to shore up this program, just given the amount of interest, the number of applications, and the value of the loans that folks are requesting. So as I mentioned, this was meant to be the most generous of the programs. So if you think about it like this, if you generally qualify for a Small Business Administration SBA program right now, you're going to qualify. You're going to qualify for this program, and as you can see, they also entered some folks that typically aren't eligible for SBA programs, such as the self-employed and independent contractors. This will also include restaurant and hotel folks on a per location basis, and this is important because for some of these SBA programs, they look at the total, right? They look at the total number of franchisees, for example, and if you add those up, you get more than 500 employees. So for the purposes of this, it looks at your circumstance on a per location basis. So how much can you borrow? So you can borrow 2.5 months of your average payroll expenses, and there's a formula to calculate this. Jessica, I know, mentioned that she has shared our guide on this. I want to say it's about 4 pages. I think it's pretty good in detail about how you determine this calculation and how you ultimately arrive at how much you want to take out, in the form of a loan. That's something that we continue to update. I also shared with Jessica, the Treasury Department just provided some additional frequently asked questions and answers for this program, and that's another document that's living, breathing. They continue to update as this program is rolled out. So where do we expect folks to get these loans? This is going from your local and national lenders. So if you already work with a lender that's a SBA Section 7A lender, they're automatically qualified. I think I was reading today that Treasury has also provided some non-bank lenders, such as I want to say PayPal and Square, to also partake in this program. And the goal is to really have a wide number of lenders participate in this program. Treasury on its website, it has a rundown of not only this program, the FAQs, but they also have a lender search where you plug in your zip code and you can find folks that are partaking in this program. So with this program, there's minimum requirements, right, for obtaining a loan. And there's, as you can see, no collateral, no personal guarantee needed. And really what the Hallmark feature is that next bullet point about converting to grants equal to the amount spent. So the way the bill is laid out, it looks at 8 weeks of your expenses after the date of the origination of the loan. You get to tally everything up that you spend on payroll, you spend on rent for your business, you spend on interest on your mortgage, on your utility payments, and a few other business or qualified business expenses. And if you hit a certain percentage, right, and the vast majority of this has to be spent on payroll, right, because the ultimate objective of this is to keep people on the payroll. So if you spend, I believe it's 75% has to be spent on payroll. But if you do that, these loans will be forgiven as long as you either rehire your employees, keep them on the payroll till June 30th. You got to rehire them within 30 days of getting the loan. Obviously, you can't have more forgiven than you actually borrowed. And you can see these bottom couple bullet points here about the loan forgiveness being reduced proportionally if you take people off or if you reduce their wages. Now, there are some caps on this, for the purposes of calculating payroll, for example. It's only up to the first $100,000 in compensation, and then after that, you can't count that towards your ultimate calculation. And that's really what Congress wanted, right? They wanted this to be targeted towards middle income earners. So we have received some questions about, what if businesses are deemed non-essential, they're not allowed to operate, pursuant to state or local law. For the purposes of this program, it doesn't look at that. It looks at what you do after you have the loan, right? After you have the loan, are you bringing folks back on the payroll? Are you paying them? That's really what this is taking a look at. So as I mentioned, there have been some updates to this program as Treasury Department, as SBA have implemented it. The interest rate originally was 0.5%. That's now up to 4%. These mature after 2 years, right? If they're not converted to a grant, you have to use 75% of the loan proceeds on payroll, as I mentioned, which certainly reduces the amount that you can spend on utilities, mortgage, and other business expenses. And more banks keep coming online. I know that there were varying stories about, some national lenders, for example, were only using customers that they had, prior relationships with. But this is, like I said, there are more lenders coming online. Consult Treasury, consult folks that you've worked with. As I mentioned, if you already work with an SBA Section 7A lender, they're going to be qualified for this program. To find out more, there's our guide right there that I referenced earlier. And we also have guides about the disaster loans that we'll talk about next, and a few other provisions of the CARES Act that, as I mentioned, we continue to update as we get additional guidance from the administration. So another program that's available to small businesses, self-employed ICs, and nonprofits are these SBA economic injury disaster loans, EIDL loans. So God forbid you've ever had to use one of these, you're familiar with them. It's what you use after a flood, a tornado, something along those lines. And they've been around for a very long time. So not only did they buttress the existing program, but they also added a new feature into it that we'll talk about. So generally small business and nonprofits qualify here, including the faith-based. And also local chambers of commerce can apply for these, even though there has been a little bit of hiccup in processing those and something we work out. So Jessica, happy to talk about that offline. So how much can you borrow? So this is an actual loan. Unlike the paycheck program, this will not generally convert from a loan to a grant. This is an actual loan. You can borrow up to $2 million in working capital at a 30-year term at 3.75%, I believe, is the interest rate. And if you take out one of these EIDL loans, payments are deferred up to 1 year, so you don't have to start immediately repaying it. They've made it easier for individual businesses to apply. Your loan's going to be based on your credit scores. You don't have to immediately produce your tax returns when you apply for one of these EIDLs. You get up to $200,000 without a personal guarantee, and no collateral is required for a loan of $25,000 or less. Generally, there is some general security interest typically tied to real estate, but they're trying to move away from that. So as you see at the third to last bullet point here, this is a new feature of the CARES Act. And this was a provision that allows folks that are applying for the EIDL loan. And I was talking to someone, I haven't looked at the loan application myself, but I was chatting with someone that has. And I guess it's the same form. There's a box that you check. They created this emergency grant program that's worth up to $10,000. The law provided, or the law sought to have these issued within 3 days. It's my understanding that folks have been waiting longer than that for this, and I don't have any updated guidance on that. I'm very sorry about that, but generally this was really looking at providing an emergency $10,000 grant if folks choose to use the EIDL loans here. The unique feature about this is that if you apply for an EIDL loan and you also apply for this $10,000 emergency grant, you get the emergency grant, but you're ultimately denied the EIDL loan. You don't have to repay that $10,000. You'll see there, unlike the paycheck program, you apply directly through the SBA for this program. You don't go to your local lender. You apply through the government. And there are some interactions with the Paycheck Protection Program. And those are designed to prevent double dipping. You can't get forgiveness on the emergency grant that you receive from the EIDL program under the Paycheck Protection Program. And that's just meant, as I mentioned, to prevent any double dipping. Okay, moving right along here. Okay, so now going back in time, looking at the second phase, the phase 2 coronavirus bill, there were some provisions that are obviously important to employers. The first one deals with paid sick leave, as you'll see here. So what was included in this bill is said that there's a requirement for employers with less than 500 employees to provide 10 days of paid sick leave related to coronavirus. And this can be taken, if God forbid someone is ill, someone in the family is ill, if someone's quarantined, if you're taking care of a family member who's quarantined, or if you're taking care of a child because of a school or a daycare closure. As you'll see, leave is paid at the regular rate with a maximum of $511 per day. Unless you're taking care of a family member, then it's 2/3 of the regular rate with a maximum of $200 per day. This is on top of what is provided by the employer and provided by state and local law. And for this additional paid sick leave, this 10 days, that's being covered by the government and the employer, and the employers will be reimbursed by the federal government for that, and it comes in the form of a tax credit, refundable tax credit. You'll see down at the bottom, that second to last bullet point, there has been some concern, some talk about exemptions for folks, for businesses with less than 50 employees. And they can only be exempt from this if the leave is being tied to caring for a child whose school or daycare is closed, and if that leave would threaten the viability of the business. Generally, this does not apply to folks who can telework, who can stagger their hours, for example. Okay, paid FMLA. So this is the Family Medical Leave Act. And you'll see once again here, employers with less than 500 employees are required to provide up to 10 weeks. If employee needs to take care of a child due to a school or daycare closure. So pretty similar to what we just talked about. So, when you think about the interaction between this and the paid leave that we just talked about, employee would take 10 days of sick leave first and then would be eligible for this 10 weeks. And here, once again, leave is paid at 2/3 of the regular rate for a maximum of $200 per day, $10,000 in the aggregate. And this is, once again, also in addition to what employers might already provide to their folks, fully reimbursed by the federal government. And as you see at the bottom there, paid leave is not available if folks can telework. Let me see. More information, as I mentioned, uschamber.com. Our small business outfit co, uschamber.com/co, has all of our guides. They're also doing regular town halls, with our chief policy officer, Neil Bradley, and other folks. They're doing blog posts constantly about questions that they're receiving. They're hearing from folks as well. So I encourage you all to check that out. And we'll continue to update our guides, update our content, because we understand that this is moving pretty quickly. And there have been some hiccups along the way, so we just want to make sure folks have the best information available. So, Jessica, with that, let me stop there, and we can try and see how many questions we can answer here.
That sounds good, Kris. Well, thank you so much for the overview. So we'll go ahead and transition to the Q&A part, like Kris said. So please keep using that chat to ask your questions for Kris here on the line. We've collected some questions ahead of time as well. Some folks were able to submit when they registered. We've gotten some emailed. So what I'll do at this time is I'll go ahead and start with the questions that have already come in and give all of you on the line a chance to get in the chat box and be sending those to us as well. So, and just a reminder too, if we come across any that are really, really specific or have a more involved answer, Kris has really graciously agreed to connect with folks offline, so thank you for that. If we don't get to your question today, know that we will follow up with an answer. So whether that is offline with Kris or we have the info in our office, we're going to get that answer to you. So if it doesn't come up right now in this Q&A, don't fear that. So one question that we got ahead of time from a member was asking specifically about minority-owned businesses. Kris, are there any provisions in the CARES Act that sets aside any funding or additional tax credits for minority-owned businesses?
Most of me wants to say no on that answer, because I believe they just kind of made a general program. I know that has been a topic of conversation. I mentioned that the Senate was looking at replenishing some of these funds today. And I know the House and Senate Democrats were looking at specifically allotting some of that money for minority-owned, veteran-owned, tribal businesses. But I generally don't believe that's applicable in this first round.
Okay. So one thing we're hearing from members, and you touched on this a little bit too, we've got one question about it in the chat today, is that in both applying for PPP loans and the EIDL loans, they're not hearing anything back. So what are recommendations that you could give or that you're hearing? If folks haven't heard anything, are there ways to expedite that, work with their lender? Who should they reach out to?
I keep talking to the lender, and there's a scenario where, let's say you applied for an EIDL loan ahead of the paycheck program coming online. So that's where you end up with both. And that's where you have some of these provisions that prevent the double counting, double dipping. On the EIDL, I've heard from folks that have been waiting, over a week, almost a week and a half, 2 weeks for these. It's something that we talk to the administration on. I think it's just a matter of processing. On the PPP, it's a little bit different because there was a deluge of applications. The system actually went down for a day. They're still clarifying the application, so I'll continue just to speak with the lenders about that, figure out what the status is, and figure out what they're hearing. Right? What are they hearing from Treasury, for example?
Yeah, and I can provide as well. So we will be sending up follow-up after this call for all of you on the line. And we can also provide, there is a number specifically for the EIDL loan that you can call. I will warn, we had a member yesterday call, and I think the wait time was 1 hour and 15 minutes. So it's not a short stint. You may want to go start some laundry while you wait, but we do have a phone number and an email for them that we can provide. So another question we've gotten here is about the payroll protection program. So I'm getting a few different questions about calculations, hiring levels. So let's talk about that. So first one is if someone has already furloughed or laid off employees,
Right.
You said they need to rehire once the loan is received. Can you give some clarification about two parts of it? One, how long they have to do that. Somebody in here said that they've seen that you have till June 30th. There's this 8-week timeline that they're paying for payroll. So a little clarity on how long and when you need to bring people back. And then to what levels they need to return to. So are we returning to staffing levels at the end of January or a few weeks ago? Had some confusion around that as well.
Yeah, so generally you have to bring folks back within 30 days of the loan, and you got to keep them on the payroll to June 30th. As I mentioned, this was supposed to be a bridge for the next couple months until we return to normal commerce. And one thing that Congress and administration are thinking about is in future legislation, how well is this program working? What is it? How is it stuck? Right? Have there been any flaws? What do we need to do? And that thinking's already going on. So yeah, generally 30 days. You have 30 days to bring them online. You got to keep them through June 30th.
Okay, thank you. And kind of to piggyback on what you just said there, not to ask you to predict the future, but there is a lot of buzz going on about this potential fourth package, CARES Act 2.0, I think you called it.
Right.
So what are you hearing about when that might be coming down the pike? I've heard a couple theories on it potentially being 2 phases, even one with them not in Washington and one in. So if you could just comment on what you're hearing about that and what folks can maybe be watching for.
If I had to guess today, I think that we will see additional funds provided for the small business, right, the paycheck program. I think that we'll see additional funds provided by that within a week or two, because that's going to run dry. And as I mentioned, that's first come, first serve. And certainly there is a lot of demand for it, and that's certainly healthy and a good thing. So I think that you'll see that. I think that will move without members coming back. That will have to be an agreement between Republicans and Democrats in the administration on that. As I mentioned, they tried to do it this morning, but there was a divergence in views. Republicans wanted just a clean $250 billion to go back into the additional to go into the fund, and then Democrats are looking at also providing funds, but then they wanted on top. They wanted in addition to that additional funds for hospitals and then state and local funds. So there just is an agreement on there. I think there is certainly an agreement that that more funds are going to be needed for the paycheck program, so that it doesn't run out. So I think you'll see that, and then later this month, later in April, I think you'll see possibly a CARES Act 2.0 that builds on what was done this go around. There has been some talk about possibly doing infrastructure, right? I think that that's pushed down the line, and I think that the next round you'll see something that talks about providing additional protective equipment, providing possibly new small business programs or something along those lines. But I think first you'll see replenishment of funds, and then you'll see a larger ledge package probably at the end of this month.
Great. So turning to the payroll protection program, this has obviously been an area of confusion for many, and the document that the U.S. Chamber created on how to calculate that has been hugely helpful for many. Let's just talk about that a little bit. So I've got 2 kind of specific questions. One, you commented on, but if we could dive into a little more, how should contractors be handled in the payroll protection program calculation? And a second question is, are employer taxes to be included in the 2.5-month average for that calculation?
I would need to look up the second one on our guide. I'm going to read, someone actually chatted me about this. I'm going to read the exact answer from the Treasury FAQ on contractors.
That's
I don't want to get this one right. So the question is, should payments that an eligible borrower made to an independent contractor or sole proprietor be included in the calculation of the eligible borrower's payroll costs? Answer, no. Any amounts that an eligible borrower has paid to an independent contractor or sole proprietor should be excluded from the business's payroll costs. However, an independent contractor or sole proprietor will itself be eligible for a loan under the PPP if it satisfies the applicable requirements. So they want businesses to apply separately from what they use on their ICs and their sole proprietors. And they want those folks to then in turn apply for their own PPP loan.
Okay. And if anybody still has confusion on that one, do chat us those questions because we can follow up on that one a little more one-on-one. I know that's been caused a little bit of heartache for people to figure out. So on the EIDL loan, so with the cash advance, so as you pointed out, that program changed with the CARES Act coming out. So that was not originally part of the EIDL loan. Right. So I've had some folks a little bit confused about who does or doesn't need to reapply and where the line is from the application. So when should people reapply? Talk a little bit about that, and then I'll hold the second question.
I don't know if folks generally need to reapply. I think they need to keep checking the status. I haven't seen any guidance that encourages folks to reapply. Certainly, as I mentioned, there are interactions between the varying programs. But I don't know about reapplying. No one's advised me on that.
And I believe, and I can regurgitate, I was on a call with Kevin Courtois, one of the U.S. Chamber counterparts yesterday, and I think he had said before March 30th that checkbox was not on there. So I think that guidance, that has been out there as well. Yeah. So if you applied after March 30th, it's our understanding that you are fine. leave it be. And then you talked a little bit about timelines too, so touch on that as well. As far as with the timelines for the EIDL loans, and we're hearing different things on the payroll protection as well. What are you hearing from lenders as far as any holdups on the lender side? We've also heard some, I don't know if rumor is the right word, but we've been hearing on the state level that some lenders are favoring individuals that have already been in their system. And what can folks do if they aren't in that situation or be thinking about?
Yeah, so there have been instances of lenders, at least right out of the gate, some lenders favoring folks that they already have existing business relationships with. I think my point on that would be, they are constantly trying to expand the pool of lenders. As I mentioned, Treasury has a lender finder, matchmaker, if you will, that will point you in the direction of who's available, right? And as I mentioned, any lender that participates in the SBA Section 7A program is already qualified for this. So, they're I don't want to tell you to not use the lender that you've used, but if they're not servicing, certainly there are going to be additional options out there. And there are rumors. I think we've heard it all. I think we've heard the same thing that folks are reading. In the news that obviously the system crashed for a full day. There's been a deluge of applications that have gone in. There's been varying, numbers reported as to how many people have actually applied, what was the total amount. So I think my best general advice is apply when you're ready, sooner rather than later. Make sure that you're getting that in, that you've done the math correctly, you've talked with your lender about it. This is now just me speculating. I'm hard pressed to imagine a scenario where this program runs out of money. I can't foresee Congress or the administration letting this program run out of money at the moment because they've already made maneuvers to try and shore it up. But that being said, certainly, when you're ready, when you've done the math, when you've done your homework, when you figure out what programs work for you, certainly apply sooner rather than later.
So changing attention a little bit to the stimulus checks for individuals. So you said earlier in the webinar that folks were hearing that those checks will go out in the next couple weeks. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, those should be direct deposits. There was some confusion for our more seasoned, our older population about whether or not they had to file taxes. They cleared that up. I see there's a question here about low income. The only restrictions, or not restrictions, but cap that I'm aware of is obviously the total amount that we outlined. For individuals, 1,200 individuals, 2,400 joint filers, 500 for kids, and then that's phased out after $75,000 if you're an individual, and then $150,000 if you're a couple, you file jointly. That's where you start to see the phase out of the check.
Okay. And then so we've gotten some self-employed questions as well. So for businesses that are self-employed with no employees, one question that I've been hearing is, can they apply for unemployment insurance in that scenario if they've been shut down?
I don't know on that. I know that, as I mentioned, they made the paycheck program available for sole proprietors, for independent contractors, for the self-employed, and they removed the restrictions that typically are associated with other SBA programs. But I'm not familiar with the UI question.
Okay, we can hunt for that one a little bit afterwards, no problem. So with the loans as well, can you talk about the interaction between the different sources of funding? So one of the questions we got emailed to us for today's webinar was, can folks apply for both the payroll protection program and the economic injury disaster loan? Is it one or the other? And then how those are interacting with other programs. So are there restrictions with those on receiving, say, local grants or local loans in addition to those?
I don't believe that there's any restrictions. You can apply for both. Just as I mentioned, there are interactions between them that prevent you, for example, for using the emergency grant from EIDL on the paycheck protection forgiveness. But no, I mean, you can apply for both. Where you have the restrictions is some of the other provisions, right? That if you decide to utilize the deferment of payroll taxes, for example, you can't obtain a PPP loan. Or if you want to use the employee retention credit that we talked about, you also cannot participate in the paycheck program.
Okay. So other restrictions, but not accessing multiple loans.
Right. I'm not that I've run into, but once again, ask your lender about that.
Okay. Well, I think so. I am drying up on questions that have been submitted already here. I'll give everybody another second to throw any questions in the chat. Kris, this has been incredibly helpful. Thank you for going through those. And like I said,
I really appreciate the invitation, Jessica. And like I said, things are happening fast. Make sure you keep checking the websites for any updates, and we're always happy to run down questions. And we'll continue to host as many virtual town halls as we can to provide the updates, and also certainly all of our resources online are living and breathing, and they're updated almost in near real time.
Perfect. So with that, if you guys do have other questions, do feel free to continue to email us, continue to reach out. Even outside of this webinar, we're happy to reach out to our counterparts at U.S. Chamber, Illinois Chamber, try and find those answers for you. And many of them we have access to in our office. So I do want to, as we wrap up here, just give a couple of reminders. One, today's webinar has been recorded.